name is Katie, and I'm here with Jennifer.
Hi.
And today, for April, which is National Poetry Month, we thought we would discuss some audiobooks that we've listened/read, whatever verb you want to use, that are either novels in verse or actual poetry. And so, Jennifer, you want to kick us off? What did you listen to?
All right. Well, I went for the poetry angle of things.
Okay.
I like listening to novels in verse, but I thought, I just don't read enough poetry, straight up poetry. So the first one I read was Call Us What We Carry by Amanda Gorman. It was published in 2022, and if the name Amanda Gorman sounds familiar, it's because she was the young poet who read at the Biden inauguration, and that poem, The Hill We Climb, is actually the last one in this volume, so you get to hear it all over again, and it's just as moving the second, third, 50th time around. She's just got a brilliant use of language and a wonderful cadence to her poems. She does read all her poems herself, which is wonderful. She has a few poems about the pandemic. There are some with mythological references. One of her really long poems, Monomyth, is kind of a concise history of the first year and a half of the pandemic. So listening to that is kind of like, oh yeah, I remember about that. And oh yeah, that's what it was like back then. Because the past 3 years' time has just had no meaning anymore. So listening to that was kind of bringing back down to earth as to what we experienced. But like I said, she's got a wonderful way with words, and some of the lines really jumped out at me, and I had to pause the audiobook to write them down because they moved me so much. Like, since the world is round, there is no way to walk away from each other, for even then we are coming back together.
Aw.
Yeah,
that's a nice sentiment.
That really, really hit me. And the nice thing about poetry books is they go fast. Mm-hmm. So this one was just a little over 3.5 hours, and it was just a sheer pleasure to listen to her.
Aw, lovely.
Yeah.
And I love when you get to hear poets read their own poetry, because you get that cadence and you get the emotion that you might not necessarily feel when you're reading just the text. Yeah, because when you're reading it, you can kind of see where the pauses are, but when you really hear it as spoken by the person who put it all together, you get more of a sense of the feeling behind it, I think. Sure. So yeah, that makes it extra special. How about you? So I actually read 2 novels in verse. I didn't mean to. I actually, when I downloaded the one, I thought it was just poetry. Oopsie. Anyway, so the first one I'm going to talk about is called Forget Me Not. It's by Ellie Terry. And so 3 hours again, it's they're poems that have been strung together to be a story, if you're not familiar with the phrase novel in verse. And this actually is narrated by 2 people, because we have 2 points of view, and those are Heather Costa and Matt Godfrey. And Heather Costa has done quite a few books, and I think she's a great narrator. So anyway, it's about Callie. She has moved to this new town, and she is very lonely. In part because in one of the poems is her talking about all the rocks she's collected in all of the places she's lived, and she keeps them in an egg carton, and she's hoping she doesn't have to fill the last 2 slots. And this has only been like the last couple of years. So mom is a little flighty. Mom has had some trouble with men in her life, and so they're constantly moving. Mom's getting these new cheap jobs, not to demean anyone, but so we're introduced to Callie as she moves into this new town with the assumption of, this is going to be terrible, I'm not going to make any friends. And part of this strained relationship with her mother is not just that they're moving constantly, it's that Callie has Tourette's syndrome. And her mom is clearly embarrassed by her, which is heartbreaking. Yeah. And so Callie really tries to reel in her tics and the noises that she makes, which are narrated really well, and So anyway, she does prove herself wrong. She becomes friends with their neighbor. His name is Jinsong. He is the child of Chinese immigrants. And so he's a wonderful character, and he's our other narration. Now, I'd say, and I made a note, Callie's point of view definitely feels more like poetry than Jinsong's. His feels more story, which I wondered if the author did on purpose. But in the end, I won't give away the end, but it is hopeful and very uplifting. And, there is some reconciling with, like, this is who I am, and everyone needs to accept me for me. And so that did make me happy. But yeah, it was a lovely story.
Nice. And I assume that's a young adult novel.
Okay. Yeah, because there's a little bit of romance between her and Jinsong. Yeah. I can't remember if they explicitly say how old they are, but I'd probably guess like sophomore, junior.
Okay.
High school age.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
What else did you listen to?
My second book of poetry, audiobook of poetry, is actually a little bit of a rarity. It's one that's by Mary Oliver, and it's actually read by Mary Oliver. Now, she's one of my favorite poets because she does so much about these really detailed observations in nature.
Okay.
And she died in 2019, and while she did do some public performances of her poetry, she very rarely recorded it. So this one at Blackwater Pond is just an hour long, and it includes some of her more famous poems like Wild Geese, Goldenrod, and The Summer Day, which the title may not sound familiar to you, but it's where the line comes from, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?"
Okay.
And that's a line that you see a lot. That's one of her most famous quotes. So, like I said, it's a very short listen. The book originally came out in 2006. I don't know if it was the audiobook originally came out in 2006, but I guess re-released in 2019, the year of her death. And listening to it, she was a much older poet than Amanda Gorman. So there's a very distinct difference in how they read their poems. And so listening to Mary Oliver is a little bit like listening to history.
Okay.
Even though it was recorded late in her life, the cadences of how she reads poetry are very...
Like listening to an elder dispatch wisdom.
It's that, but it's also like mid-century.
Okay.
Mid-20th century to, like 1950s to 1980, roughly. That kind of academic reading of poetry that has a flow to it, but it's also... It doesn't have quite this, it's got life to it, but it doesn't have quite the same liveliness to it as a more modern poet would. And it just shows you how poetry has changed over the years. Yeah. So it was really a nice way to contrast the two, I think. And I got to hear two of my favorite voices. So how about you?
So the other novel in verse I listened to is called The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin. It's by Kip Wilson.
I didn't realize that was novel in verse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, again, pretty short. It's about 4 hours for the audiobook. And if you liked the musical Cabaret, you will like this because it's that same time period. So this takes place in 1932 in Berlin. So Hitler is starting to get better known, and the whole time his presence is kind of looming over all of the characters, but he isn't featured. Nobody's being called like a Nazi, or they're like kind of in the periphery, like this crazy group, but they're loud.
Yeah, they're not in power yet.
And our main character is Hilda. And so it starts right as she comes of age and therefore gets kicked out of her orphanage that she had to grow up in. And so she knows, based on experiences of previous female orphans, that she needs to find a job right away, because sometimes desperation leads to bad choices that she doesn't want to make those choices. And so she is able to find a job, and she's kind of awkward and like adorable in a way. But she kind of manages to get this job at Cafe Lila, which is a cabaret, and just as a waitress, and very shy lead character. And so, but as she becomes friends with these people, and it is a queer club on top of that, which we all know Hitler's not going to be a big fan of.
Not too much.
And so as she kind of like learns about herself and meets new people, and makes these friendships, she gets a little less shy. And then, of course, the stunning moment of when she starts to sing, and then all of her friends are, oh, you have to sing on stage because you're amazing. And she's like, no, introvert, like. And then, of course, you know, the big reveal of her voice for everybody. And so a slight trigger warning for just like police brutality and the anti-Semitism and the homophobia that you would associate with 1930s Germany, but a very hopeful and gripping story. So I enjoyed it a lot. And that was narrated by Juliet Goglia. And she just flows. I didn't know her name before this, but she read it very well.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah. I've come across that title before, but wow, that sounds good. Okay.
Yeah, so what do we have coming up next month?
Well, next month is May, and we are going to be talking about middle grade books. And we will have a special guest for you from our children's department. Miss Melanie is going to join us to talk about some of her favorite middle grade audiobooks too. So it should be a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks for joining us for this month's Listening Librarians.
And we'll see you next month talking about middle grade. Bye-bye.